The fork was perfectly straight. That's what I noticed first. Not the woman sitting across from my son. Not the way she laughed, half a beat too late at something my wife said. Not the careful way she touched his arm whenever she wanted to make a point. The fork. My son had set it down beside his plate and aligned it to the edge of the tablecloth with 2 deliberate fingers, the way he used to do when he was 9 years old and needed me to get him out of somewhere without making a scene. He was 33 now. We were sitting at my dining room table at Thanksgiving, and his girlfriend of 5 months was telling my wife about a yoga retreat she'd done in Sedona, and Landon was looking at me from across the table, with his hands folded in his lap and the fork lying perfectly straight beside his plate. We invented the signal at my brother-in-law's birthday party in 2001. Landon was 9, and my wife's aunt, a woman who could convert any topic into a 45-minute monologue about her Persian cats, had cornered him by the dessert table and showed no signs of releasing him. He caught my eye across the room. I watched him pick up his fork and lay it perpendicular to his plate, perfectly straight. I had no idea what it meant, but I walked over and said I needed him to help me carry something from the car. He followed me out. On the way back in, he said, "Can that mean help from now on?" I said yes. We'd used it maybe 8 or 9 times over the years, always at family events, always when he was stuck somewhere polite and needed an exit. We hadn't needed it since he was in college, and I rescued him from a very long conversation with my accountant at a 4th of July cookout. He was 33 years old, and he put the fork down at Thanksgiving, and I poured more cranberry sauce and smiled at the woman across the table and waited. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I spent 24 years as a special agent with IRS Criminal Investigation, the division that handles financial fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and related federal crimes. I worked cases involving offshore accounts, Ponzi schemes, fraudulent investment vehicles, and individuals who had made careers out of presenting themselves as opportunities. After I retired, I spent 7 years consulting for a compliance firm that worked with community banks and credit unions, identifying internal fraud risks. I had sat across from a great many charming people in my career. I was looking at one of them now, and I was starting to understand why my son had put his fork down. Her name was Serena. She had been dating my son for 5 months, which I knew because he'd mentioned her in September and brought her to Thanksgiving, which was early by his standards. He was private with relationships, always had been. The fact that she was here at all meant something to him. She was warm, attentive. She remembered my wife's name before the first course was over. She helped clear dishes without being asked. When I mentioned, offhand, that I'd renovated the back porch the previous summer, she asked specific follow-up questions. Not the polite kind, the kind that tell you a person is actually listening. She was very good. After dinner, while my wife was cutting pie in the kitchen, Serena excused herself to make a phone call. My son looked at me across the table and said quietly, "I know you saw it." "Tell me what I'm looking at," I said. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he'd been doing since he was 12, when he had something uncomfortable to say. "She's been talking to me about my 401eng," he said. "For about 3 weeks." I kept my voice even. "Tell me what she's been saying." She had framed it as concern, he told me. He'd mentioned his retirement account in passing, not the amount, just that he had one from his current job, 11 years at a software company in Austin. She'd said she hoped he wasn't just leaving it in whatever default target date fund the company had set up, because most people were. She said she worked with a small group of clients, high net worth individuals who had figured out how to make their money work harder than any employer-sponsored plan ever would. She wasn't selling anything, she'd said. She just hated watching people she cared about lose ground to inflation inside a mutual fund that charged fees nobody ever read the fine print on. She had described herself as a private wealth consultant. She said it the way people say a title that can mean whatever they need it to mean. She sent me something, he said. A private placement memorandum for something called Meridian Capital Partners. She said they're doing a limited investor intake before December 31st, tax year deadline. She said it was the reason she'd been wanting to talk to me. I was quiet for a moment. "How much is in your 401?" I asked. He met my eyes, about $220,000. 11 years of contributions, an employer, matching from a man who had been careful with money since his 20s. My wife came back in with the pie, and we talked about other things. Serena came back from her phone call, and the conversation moved on. She was warm and easy, and laughed in the right places, and I watched her, and said nothing, and thought about what a private placement memorandum looks like when it's designed to deceive rather than inform. After they left that night, my wife stood at the sink and said, "How bad?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'd like to see that document." She dried her hands on the dish towel and turned around. "What do you need?" 31 years of marriage. She has always understood the weight of a thing before I finished describing its shape. Landon forwarded me the PDF from his phone before he got home. It was 22 pages. I stayed up until nearly 1 in the morning reading it at the kitchen table. The fund was called Meridian Capital Partners, LLC. It claimed to be a private equity vehicle focused on commercial real estate development in the Sun Belt, with secondary positions in private credit facilities secured by physical assets. The projected annual returns were listed at 16 to 20%. The minimum investment was $30,000. There was a preferred allocation tier for commitments over $100,000. I went through it the way I'd gone through documents for 24 years. The fund disclosed it was operating under SEC Regulation D, Rule 506B, a federal exemption that allows companies to raise money from accredited investors without registering a full offering with the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is legal and common. It is also one of the most frequently abused exemptions in existence, because it requires very little public disclosure and depends almost entirely on the issuer's own representations. There was no auditor named anywhere in the document. The performance projections cited no independent verification. The section describing the secured physical assets, the collateral underlying the private credit facilities, contained no schedule of assets, no description of what the collateral actually was. Just language saying positions were secured by hard assets consistent with fund strategy. That is the written equivalent of a locked box with a sign on it reading "Trust Us." The registered address on the cover page was in Wilmington, Delaware. I looked it up. It was a registered agent service, the kind that charges $400 a year to give your company a Delaware mailing address and forward your mail. No office. No Meridian Capital Partners in any SEC filing I could pull that night, though the absence wasn't itself unusual under 506. What I needed was people who could move faster than I could alone. I had two. The first was a woman who had been in IRS Criminal Investigation when I was, and had moved to the SEC's Enforcement Division in Fort Worth before she retired. She picked up on the second ring when I texted her the next morning. The second was a forensic CPA named Gareth I'd worked with on a case in 2017. He had spent 20 years doing fraud examination before starting his own practice. He could look at a financial document and tell you within 30 minutes whether the math was built to inform or to confuse. I read him sections of the Meridian memorandum over the phone. He stopped me twice. "The returns," he said, 16 to 20% on private real estate credit, with no auditor and no asset schedule. I know. There's no there. The collateral section is a placeholder. I've seen this exact structure before. It's a frame without a painting. If someone invests and the fund later says the position's depreciated or the credit facility's defaulted, there is nothing in this document that would allow any investor to verify that any underlying asset ever existed. You could hang anything in it, or nothing. My former colleague called me back at 10:15. "Serena Talbot," she said, 36 years old. Licensed financial advisor in Texas from 2014 to 2019, when her license lapsed. Prior to that, she worked 2 years at a registered investment advisory firm in Dallas. The firm filed a complaint with FINRA in 2018. The complaint involved an inappropriate recommendation to a client, a recently widowed man, 62 years old. He moved $48,000 into an unregistered fund at her recommendation. No SEC registration, no third-party audit. When the firm discovered it, they terminated her. FINRA conducted a preliminary inquiry. The client declined to cooperate with a formal investigation. Family pressure. He was embarrassed. I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was, a dry run, a smaller version of the same play, refined and applied again. Is Meridian registered anywhere? No Meridian Capital Partners in any SEC database. No state-level registration in Texas, Arizona, Florida, or Georgia, the states where I looked. So she's running an unregistered offering and steering investors into it. At minimum. The question is whether it's a blind pool. She takes the money, claims it went into deals that didn't perform, and investors have no way to verify otherwise. Or whether there are no real deals at all, and the money moves somewhere else entirely. She paused. How close is she to asking him to commit? PPM 3 weeks ago, December 31st deadline. How much is at risk? His retirement account, $220. A short silence. We'd both worked cases where families lost everything. The difference between those cases and this one was proximity. Okay, she said. We need her on record making the full ask. Fund name, return projections, rollover instructions, wire transfer details. In Texas, one-party consent on recorded conversations. If your son is a party to the conversation and records it himself, that recording is usable. We can work with that. He's going to have questions about what this means for the relationship. I know, but he came to you. He put down whatever signal he put down. He already knows what he's looking at. He's been waiting for you to tell him how to act on it. I drove to Landon's apartment that afternoon. He met me at the door in a t-shirt and gym shorts, his hair not quite dry, and I could see from the set of his jaw that he hadn't slept much. I sat down on his couch and told him everything. The Wilmington address, the missing asset schedule. Gareth read on the structure. The disclosure from my former colleague, the widower in Dallas, $48,000, a man too ashamed to pursue it. My son sat very still through all of it. Then he said, very quietly, she told me she could see us buying a house together someday. Not angry, just quiet. The way people go quiet when they're tracing back through every moment they'd decided to believe something, and finding the shape of what was actually underneath. I didn't say anything for a moment. There was nothing I could say that would make that land differently. He had to sit with it. After a while he looked up. What do I need to do? I explained the recording. I explained that he needed to contact her and set up a meeting. Tell her he had some final questions before the December deadline. He needed to let her make the pitch in full. Let her name the fund, describe the returns, provide the wire transfer information. He needed to give her no reason to think anything had changed. Be a man who is almost ready to say yes. Can you do that? I asked. He looked at me with those steady eyes he'd had since he was a child, the ones that didn't look away from difficult things. I spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself I was being paranoid, he said. Yeah, I can sit across from her for an hour. He texted her that evening and said he'd been giving the Meridian opportunity serious thought and had a few questions he wanted to go through in person before the year-end deadline. He said he thought better face-to-face than over text. She suggested coffee on Saturday afternoon at a place near her apartment in the city. She was delighted, warm and unhurried. There was nothing in her voice that suggested she had any reason to worry. Friday morning I drove back to his place. We sat at his kitchen table, and I walked him through exactly how to do it. Phone in his front shirt pocket, voice memo running. Let her talk. Don't rush the pitch. If she paused, let the silence sit. People fill silence. Ask clarifying questions in a neutral tone. Don't be eager, don't be cold. Be a man doing due diligence. Be a man who wants to be convinced. How are you feeling? I asked before he left. He thought about it. Angry, he said, but calm angry, the kind where you just want to get through it. That's exactly right, I said. Stay in that. I drove home. My wife made coffee, and we listened to the rain against the kitchen windows, and we didn't talk much. We waited. He texted me at 3:47. Done. Got everything. Calling in 10. His voice on the phone was even but thin in the way voices get when adrenaline is still clearing out of a body. She had been thorough, he told me. She described the fund strategy in detail. Commercial real estate bridge loans in Phoenix, Atlanta, and Charlotte. Private credit facilities collateralized by land and existing structures. Positioned to capture the spread between bank lending rates and developer demand. The projected returns, 16 to 20% annually. She said, if he committed the full balance, he'd be looking at a net gain of over $30,000 in the first year alone. She had described the rollover process. He'd move his 401(k), into a self-directed IRA at a custodian she worked with, and from there the funds would wire to the Meridian investor account. She had the account information ready. She had shown it to him on her phone. The receiving account was at an online bank based in Nevada. She had said the fund managers preferred smaller institutions because the processing speed was better than the big banks. She said his money would be in position within 72 hours of the transfer. I knew what 72 hours meant. By the time anyone identified the account as part of a fraud, if they ever did, 3 days was more than enough time to move funds through enough layers to make recovery functionally impossible. I called my former colleague that evening. She asked Landon to upload the audio file to a secure portal, which he did within the hour. She listened to it that night. She called me the next morning at 7:50. "It's enough," she said. "We're coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Texas State Securities Board. Wire fraud, securities fraud, unregistered offering. We move this week." I didn't ask for the operational details. That was not my role, and it wasn't Landon's. What I can tell you is that Serena Talbot was arrested on a Tuesday morning at the coffee shop near her apartment where she and my son had sat the previous Saturday. He called me when my former colleague sent him confirmation. He was sitting in his car in a parking garage near his office, on his lunch break. He said, "They got her, Dad." His voice was very level. "It's done." "Good," I said. "Go back to work. Take the afternoon if you need to, but go back." The investigation that followed found that she had run variations of the same scheme across 3 states over 6 years. Meridian Capital Partners was one of 2 fraudulent fund names she had used. The total confirmed losses across other victims, 7 people, not counting my son, exceeded $800,000. Some of those people had transferred their money months before Landon ever met her. He was the only one who hadn't lost a cent. He came to Christmas dinner 6 weeks later. Just the 3 of us, him, my wife, and me. She made her pot roast, the one she'd been making since he was small, the one he'd requested every birthday until he was in his 20s. We sat at the same table where he had laid his fork straight in November, and we ate, and we were quiet in the way that people are quiet after something difficult is over. He helped my wife with the dishes. He always had, since he was old enough to reach the sink. When she went upstairs to call her sister, he came and sat across from me with his coffee mug, his hands wrapped around it, and after a moment he said, "I keep asking myself why I didn't just say no the first time she brought it up." "You almost did," I said. "That's why you used the signal." He thought about that. "I mean, before she brought it up, those first few months, why did I let her get that far in?" "What were you thinking?" "The first time she mentioned your retirement account." He looked out the window at the dark yard. That she noticed. That she was paying attention to my actual life. That it meant something. I didn't say anything for a moment. "You weren't wrong about that," I said finally. "She was paying attention to your life. Very carefully. For months." The investment conversation didn't come until she'd built something that felt real, because some of it was real. The time, the consistency, the way she made you feel like you mattered to her. That's not a failure of your judgment. That's what she was good at. She'd practiced it. She had refined it on someone else before she ever met you. He was quiet. "The part that matters," I said, "is what you did when something felt wrong. You didn't completely talk yourself out of it. You reached for a signal we invented when you were 9 years old, at a party where you were cornered by a woman who wanted to talk about cats, because some part of you knew before the rest of you was ready to say it out loud, that you needed someone outside the situation to look at what was happening. That instinct is what made everything else possible." He nodded slowly. "Most people don't do that. Most people don't. That's what makes these cases so devastating. They feel something off and decide they're being paranoid. They're embarrassed to say anything. They don't want to be wrong about someone they care about. So they wait. And while they're waiting, the deadline passes, and the wire goes through, and the person is gone, and the fund never existed." We sat for a moment with the sound of my wife on the phone upstairs, and the heater clicking on against the December cold. "Is she going to prison?" he asked. "That's for the courts. What I can tell you is that the evidence is solid. The charges are serious, and there are 7 other people who now have a chance at some form of accountability, because you didn't let her finish what she started." He was quiet for a moment, then, I'm glad I put the fork down. So am I said. And Landon, you came to me. Don't ever stop doing that. He smiled at that, small and real. My wife came back downstairs, and we moved to the living room and put on a movie none of us particularly cared about. And she fell asleep in the recliner before the second act. And my son and I sat there in the low television light, and eventually the movie ended, and it was just a quiet house in December. And that felt like exactly the right thing to be. There are things I want to say clearly, as someone who spent 24 years working financial fraud. What happened to my son was not unusual. It is not a story about a naive person or an obvious scam. Serena Talbot was sophisticated. She built a relationship over 5 months before she ever mentioned his retirement account. By the time she made the investment pitch, he was already inside something that felt genuine, because in many ways it was. The attention was real. The time was real. The warmth was calibrated, but his experience of it was indistinguishable from the genuine article. That is precisely why it works, and why it keeps working, on intelligent people who have every reason to know better. The red flags were visible in the document, not the person. A projected annual return of 16 to 20% is not an opportunity. It is a number that functions as a signature. No legitimate registered fund sustains returns at that level over time, and anyone promising them consistently is either fabricating or taking risks that make the promise meaningless. An offering with no named auditor, a registered agent address standing in for a real business office, a year-end deadline designed to compress your decision-making, a rollover process that routes your money through a custodian the advisor selects rather than one you choose independently. These are not guarantees of fraud. They are invitations to slow down and look harder. If you are presented with any investment opportunity in the United States, you can verify whether an advisor holds a current license and whether any complaints have been filed against them through FINRA Broker Check at brokercheck.inra.org. It is free. It takes less than 5 minutes. SEC-registered funds and advisors can be verified through the SEC's EDGAR system and the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure Database, also free. If an advisor resists independent verification or suggests it isn't necessary, that resistance is the information. And if someone in your life reaches out to you in whatever way they know how to reach, listen. My son used a signal we invented at a birthday party in 2001 when he was 9 years old and needed help getting away from a conversation about Persian cats. He used it 24 years later at a Thanksgiving table, because some part of him knew, before the conscious part was ready to say it, that he needed someone on the outside to look at what was happening. That instinct is worth more than any document. Protect it in the people you love, and trust it in yourself. We didn't lose $1. The difference, in the end, was a 33-year-old man who picked up his fork and set it down perfectly straight. If something doesn't feel right, it is not nothing. It never is.